So I took you to 1 Corinthians 10, 1 through 14, and it was a rather long passage, but I think once you got there, you saw the relevance, right? The example of the wilderness generation, Paul talks about them. Paul's writing to New Testament believers. We need to remember that, right? And he has this list, and it begins, it's very clear at the beginning, right, that we're talking about this group, Moses in the wilderness. They all drank the same spiritual drink. That's when he hit the rock and it came out of the rock, right? They were drinking from a spiritual rock, and Paul likens that to Christ. That was Christ that provided that, right? Interestingly, in the New Testament, Jesus offers water, right? And that water is the gift of the Holy Spirit. Yeah, interesting. Nevertheless, with most of them, God was not well pleased. They were laid low in the wilderness. Now, these things happened as examples for us. He's talking to New Testament believers. So let's lump ourselves in with that, and let's see what it is that we are not to do. So, because that's the real question. We're trying to get to a point. What does it look like for us to live at rest? Don't be idolaters. Live with God as your ultimate authority. Don't put anything else, don't answer to anything else before you answer to God. Don't put anything else above, because that's what Adam and Eve did. That's what Noah ended up doing. That's what the people of Israel did. Don't follow their example. Don't act immorally. Let God define your moral character and your moral decisions. Let God do that. Be patient in that. Don't test the Lord. So when you learn the faithful character of who God is in one area of your life, let that build trust and let that spread to other areas of your life where you begin to trust him in other areas as well, and eventually that will envelop your whole life. Don't test the Lord. Don't grumble, verse 10. When God, now we said this last week and I thought it was good enough to repeat. When God allows a situation of stress in your life that you are incapable of solving on your own, right? He will do this. It's your response to that situation that can either lead you into rest, which is living under God's authority and timing, or unrest, assuming that we have the best solution for the situation. I'd like to kind of close our time out and our class out with a personal story. And this is one that I started teaching this whole rest concept in bits and pieces about 12 years ago. I went back in my notes and I was surprised that it's been that long. And I'm still learning a lot. So, but this was one that was early on, a personal story. So before I was in the role that I'm in now currently as a pastor, I had a real estate career. I don't know if you know that. Here in Salem, I had taught for 3 years right out of college, junior high English, and for some reason I didn't want to continue teaching junior high English. I can't figure that one out. And I had an opportunity to come down and work in my father-in-law's real estate business here in town. And so we moved down and made the switch. I'd actually taken a year's leave of absence up there just in case things didn't work out. We could maybe go back and continue teaching. But we moved, Lisa and I moved down here. I don't know if you know this, but when you're a teacher, you get a steady paycheck. There was health care involved with the steady paycheck. Things were very predictable. When I moved down here and I started selling real estate, it took me a few months, but I'm sharp enough that I figured out that if you don't sell anything, they don't pay you. And let me just say that my first year did not go well. Not only did I sell anything for the first 9 months, but my father-in-law, as gracious as he was, gave me a line of credit, which seemed like a great idea when you don't owe him any money. And because I wasn't selling anything, we racked up about $24,000 in debt. Now, you need to understand the year before teaching, I had made $21,900, okay? So I'm now over a year's income. If I go back to my old profession, I'm digging a hole, and it's being dug pretty fast. It was just basic living expenses that we were doing some business expenses, but it got pretty deep pretty fast. I was doing everything I knew how to do. I was, those of you in sales, I was cold calling, I was door knocking, I was doing open houses, it was awful. Awful because it wasn't clicking. First time in my life really where I honestly put my full effort into something and didn't get any results. It was rather frustrating. I began to wonder if I should have ever left my job back in Tacoma, right? I started to ask questions like, did we move back to Salem a little too fast? Do you remember back in Tacoma when we had a steady paycheck and health care included? I began to romanticize the place we had been. Does that sound familiar? Yeah, those people that came out of Egypt had a similar response. So the time, about the 9-month mark, the time was approaching where I had to give the school district up in Tacoma an answer. Was I going to come back after my year's leave of absence, or was I going to stick it out down here? And Lisa and I agreed that we would pray about the situation, and it sounded something like this. God, I've tried everything I know to do to solve this situation we're in. 4 weeks from now, unless you present something better, I'm seeing that as my only option, and I don't want to, but let's go, we're going back. So, and if we do that, we're just going to slowly pay off our debt. And how long is that going to take? Because you got to, oh my goodness, right? Depressing. About 2 weeks after that prayer. So we had 4 weeks where we had to make a decision. About 2 weeks into that, the builder that I had been sitting open houses for unexpectedly expanded, bought a second subdivision, and I inherited a few listings in the first subdivision, the old one, because the agent that was there moved to the new one. And it was during an open house in the 3rd week in that subdivision that I met a couple, and they were interested in building a house, and I sat that couple down in front of the builder that week, and we wrote up an offer. And it was in the 4th week that I wrote up 2 more offers from that subdivision. In fact, in the 4 weeks, the time limit that we had placed on God, by the way, right? In the 4-week time period that we had prayed about, God, show us something, we had written up enough business that when it eventually closed, because the houses had to get built and all other stuff, but when they eventually closed, the $24,000 was eliminated, and we had an additional $20,000 in the bank. And it was that circumstance when it was happening that we would just look at each other and say, what just happened? Because we had been looking at each other for 9 months prior to that, right? And everything we were trying nothing was working. So God proved himself faithful miraculously in a way that we couldn't have even imagined. I would have been happy with just paying off half the debt, right? But that's not how God answered. Well, life went pretty well for the next 12 years. And those of you that were connected to the real estate market in the recent past know that we had a great market during those 12 years, but eventually there was a year that was named 2008. And it was during that year that the whole financial sector in America and a lot of places around the world just sort of fell apart. People couldn't get loans, which is not good news if you're a real estate agent. People couldn't get loans to buy houses. They couldn't get loans to build houses. And I was working with a lot of builders at the time. Everything ground to a halt within about a 2 to 3 month period of time. Now, we had saved some money because we live kind of frugally. But there was a period of time of about 6 months where I tried everything I knew how to do and nothing was working. Does that sound familiar? It's dramatically different than the first time, but it's eerily familiar. And that's the way it is when God works in your life and puts impossible situations in your life. He will put eerily familiar situations in your life, but they, if you objectively look at them, they will look dramatically different. But they will have a core thing in the same. So once again, Lisa and I having tried everything we knew how to do, saw that our savings was running out. Everything was quickly getting spent. So we had a decision. We were in a financial crisis, and we weren't able to solve it on our own. So let me ask you a question. Based on this study, what choice did we have? We had kind of two ways to go. What's one way we could have responded? Grumbling and complaining, which is really the way I forgot to mention, I was highly depressed during that first episode, right? Hard to get out of bed, grumbling, complaining, wishing I was back in Tacoma, which in the scenario, Tacoma is kind of like Egypt, which if you've ever been to Tacoma, that's not fair for parts of Tacoma. Okay, so we had this choice. Could grumble and complain, but a new choice was spawned in our life because of the way God had responded to us the first time. Miraculously, unexpectedly responded to us in faithfulness. And we realized, and we made a conscious decision, because by this time, in 2008, I'd already started teaching this stuff out of Hebrews 3 and 4. I'd already discovered it. I taught it to other people. And so it's a little more pressure on you, right? And so we sat down and we said, okay, we've got a choice. We literally said that. We have a choice. How are we going to respond? And here's the prayer we had. God, we have no idea how you're going to solve this one, but we trust that you can, right? We will keep working. We'll do everything that we know to do. We'll take direction from you along the way. We'll have our eyes and ears open for an unexpected solution, and we'll wait for your timing. That's a Jesus response of the temptation, right? That's a Jesus response. Let's wait for God and his timing and expect something magical to happen. Well, about 3 weeks after that, I got a call from a pastor that I had helped purchase a house as a real estate agent. We had developed a friendship. He had offered me a job several times before when the market was doing really well, and I always said, "Oh, Dave, you can't afford me," right? And I only half jokingly was saying that. This time, Dave was on the other end of the line, and he asked, like he always did, "When are you going to come work for me?" And I actually said to him, "Dave, I think you can afford me now." Yeah. And it was over the next 2 months that I accepted a full-time position at this church. And I began talking with agents in my office about purchasing, or having them purchase the business from me, which in a down real estate market doesn't happen, but it happened in my case. So as before, God's solution was quite unexpected. I did not ever see myself ending up on a church staff. It was quite unexpected, but our response this time led to a completely different experience for us as a couple. This time it was an expectant response. It was a hopeful response. And I have to say it was restful, right? Because we're falling under the authority of someone that has more control than we do, and thank God that he does. So as we close out, the question really is, how is it that God has shown himself faithful in your life? I've given you one example in my life. That's not the only example in my life. And I know if you're a person of faith that you've been walking for any amount of time, you have your own stories that are very similar to that. What are the areas he's tested you in? What was your response when he's tested you? What could it be in the future? Could it be different? Could it be better? Could it be more restful? These are good questions not only to ask yourself, but if you're dating somebody, good questions to ask that significant other to start to develop an idea of thinking about how we live at rest. If you're married, these are great questions to ask each other in front of God. So, Hebrews 4, verse 7, let's end there. The last question on your lesson today was, according to Hebrews 4:7, what day is the Sabbath rest available to the believer if they hear God's voice? And what's the answer? Today. That's today. Today, if you hear his voice. And what's significant about today, you've already put it together, It's always today. It's always today. Sabbath rest is available today, and it's always today. So, today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts, but rather let your hearts become softened by the faithfulness of God, and trust him enough to fall under his authority and under his rule, and find Sabbath rest, the Sabbath rest that remains for the people of God.